Okay, so today I'm going to have a look at this article, Stylish Same-Sex Campaign Glosses Over Real Issues. Now, if we have a look at this term glosses over, this is a cliche. So I'm just going to pop up the meaning of this cliche for you. Where are we? While we're waiting for the cliche to load, let's have a look at stylish same sex. So here we have alliteration, which is the repetition of the consonant sound, but it's also more than alliteration, it's also what we call sibilance. Sibilance is the repetition of an S sound. So why are they wanting to emphasize stylish same sex? Style is something that comes and goes. So it's something that's not necessarily around for a long time. It's like a fad, a short fashion trend. So here they're kind of insinuating that this notion of same-sex marriage is a bit of a fad or a trend that will come and go, and yet later they allude to the fact that it might have long-term consequences. So, of course, if they're just regarding it as being stylish, they're encouraging the reader to see it as something that's not really important and worth long-term change. It's something that will just blow over. Now, glosses over the real issue. So let's see what we can find over here. To gloss over is to hide under a deceptively attractive surface or appearance. So this is this interesting notion of deceptively attractive, which ties back into stylish. So on the surface it looks, attractive and everything else like that, but obviously being deceptive, underneath it's obviously not attractive. It's to this author it is repulsive. So that might raise some suspicions from the reader as to what are they hiding and what are these repulsive elements of this campaign underneath. So if we have a look, it's interesting that the author's name up in the top is just plain Peter Jensen. But down the bottom, it has Dr. Peter Jensen is the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney. So why have just Peter Jensen in plain up the top and then Dr. Peter Jensen, the Anglican Archbishop of Sydney, down the bottom? Probably because they don't want the reader to think that the author has any kind of religious or academic bias. Um, the author wants to put their argument forward not as a religious debate, but as a logical debate, and they try to appeal to the reader's sense of reason and logic by breaking up their debate into sort of three sections. They start by introducing marriage equality, marriage won't change, and it's inevitable, and as you can see, tries to address the inevitability, and at the beginning tries to address marriage equality. So by having a logical structure, they hope that the reader will see their debate as not being fueled by any particular type of religion or anything else like that, but as being logic and logical. So in the picture here, we see a lot of sort of smiling faces, Australian flag. We can see that this would be a rainbow coloured umbrella, and they've got some sort of banners and slogans. Now, this picture isn't really the sort of picture that's going to persuade a reader to go one way or another. Because if anything, it looks quite positive with the way it unifies homosexuality and Australian symbols all in the one picture. So really, I think it probably would have been produced maybe in colour, so you could have seen the rainbow colour. I think it would have been more of a way to draw attention to this article and also segue into these ideas of these slogans at the protests. Now, the use, especially you can see in the caption of the photo, marriage equality in inverted commas, that's often used to quote something but show that the writer isn't necessarily supporting that view of marriage equality. So maybe it raises the reader's curiosity as to why he doesn't consider this to be marriage equality. We later find on his argument about it not being equal at all. Yes, this is inclusive language here to feel that everybody is involved, and this notion of this country as well sort of affects all of Australia. Notice how he says in the midst of a sustained and brilliantly orchestrated campaign. So again, he feels like he's sort of talking about how this movement is so sort of calculating and sort of orchestrated. Let's have a look at that word orchestrated. Define orchestrated. Okay, so really planned or to get the desired effect, especially surreptitiously. Let's have a look at this one. Surreptitious. Okay, so this is this notion. So we're getting down to these connotations of something that's kind of um, almost maybe kept secret, because it might not be approved of, and we can see how that links into this article. So this notion of orchestrating something sounds like it's almost a conspiracy or something that we need to be suspicious of. And that idea is continued with all these inverted commas. So we're meant to question these three slogans of marriage equality, marriage won't change, and it's inevitable. Um, Now, notice that he says here, of course, the difficulty with slogans is that they're not arguments and so are hard to refute, except by slogans in return. Now, all the use of commas in here seems to add a bit of a tone. Of course, the difficulty with slogans is that they're not arguments and so are hard to refute, except by slogans in return. So we see a bit of a snide attitude emerging towards these slogans. Suggesting that this author believes that they're not very well thought out arguments and that the reader should recognise them as such. Okay. So, in a way, he is trying to do an analysis of the way that this campaign, this brilliantly orchestrated campaign, is trying to persuade us. So, to have a look at the fact that they're playing on the commitment of our community to equality. So, it's like they're appealing to our desire for equality. Um, then he says in here, we oppose distinctive traits such as race being taken into account when they are irrelevant. And he gives this what he hopes to be a rather logical argument of, say, with a few of these analogies, comparing this situation of, say, a doubles competition of tennis. If it's a mixed doubles competition of tennis, you wouldn't have two men or you wouldn't have two women. So the reality of the world God made is that human beings are in two sexes, male and female. So here he kind of gives up, obviously, his religious inclinations. But first of all, let's look at this appeal to logic, and that is that we accept that, if we can accept this analogy of mixed doubles not including two men and two women, because that would be illogical, it wouldn't be mixed, we can see how that could apply to the situation of marriage. Um, and yes, in fact, all of us oppose marriage equality. That's a generalization, and we're like, oh, well, that's a bit rich, because some people who might be reading this, an audience who might be in favour of same-sex marriage, might think, well, hold on a second, I'm all for marriage equality. But then he brings in these examples of we don't allow people to marry a minor, we don't allow people to marry their siblings, therefore we all oppose marriage equality. Um, and yeah, if marriage equality was meaningful, it should encompass all of these possibilities. It does not. Now, notice how he likes to use these short paragraphs or these short sentences. That helps to make his point kind of very assertive and very clear. Um, and again, using that appeal to logic. Now notice that he keeps putting the word right in inverted commas to suggest that marriage isn't really a right, and he talks about that a little bit later when he talks about human rights. So perhaps we could suggest that this author feels that marriage is more of a privilege, and he talks here, this notion of rightly, which he's juxtaposed position next to, he's saying what we rightly lack is the right to marry anyone we choose without discrimination. And he's saying that it's important that we lack that right. So here he's making the distinction through putting these next to each other by juxtaposing between what is a real right down here and what is not a real right. He's juxtaposing that so that the reader can see. Now, here he's using that inclusive language a lot of the time as well. When he's saying we, though, he's probably speaking very much on behalf of the church. And he's saying that this wasn't a mistake, this was purposeful, and there's reasons behind it. So it's kind of brings you back to this logic, well, if something is not a mistake, then there is no need to fix it. So again, here he does his short, sharp, and rebuttal, and he's doing this as a personal testimony because they said your own marriage wouldn't change, and he said my marriage would be different. I'd have to find a different word for it. So that's the personal testimony. So by him giving, although he's not very clear there, but we're not meant to criticise how well he argues. He suggests that in his personal experience things would change, and we tend to respect and listen to personal testimonies because somebody's kind of willing to put their experience on the line. Now, we then have an appeal to family values because he's talking about the education of his children, and therefore that would be the education of anybody's children, and the notion of what kind of moral education that they're given. So, people who are perhaps, self-interested or care about their family, before when they thought, well, other people of the same sex marrying, that's not going to affect me. Here he argues that not only will it affect them, but it will also affect their children as well. So they realise that it is an issue that should concern them. Okay. And as well, he comes back to that notion of rights and he says to call marrying rights, it's kind of like a blight or an insult to human rights in general. It says here it cheapens the discourse, which means that, it makes the discussion not so important. When we think of rights, we're going to start thinking of less important things like the right to eat chocolate or something like that. So people, if they are supporters of human rights, they might feel a call to action here that they need to preserve this sort of language being bandied about. Okay, so here he uses statistics to obviously support his point of view that the marriage is not inevitable, that most people are still voting against same-sex marriage, but he does raise a concern using such language as pervasive, distorted, this notion of remaining silent. He tries to suggest that all of this kind of political discourse and these protests have been having an effect on democracy, which is something that people in, countries such as Britain, Australia, and America are very concerned about. So we've got this notion of this pervasive policy causing us to remain silent. It's affecting democracy. Therefore, to preserve democracy, we would want to oppose this kind of movement. Okay. So down here he emphasizes obviously that long term it's never going to work, but short term it could be damaging. Notice that he says same-sex marriage is not even possible. So this might raise some questions for some people because they're like, well, it is possible so people from the same sex get married. But of course, coming from a religious perspective, he believes very firmly that that wouldn't be marriage at all. Notice how he says the law reflected the truth that human beings have always known. So he again is suggesting, but not saying straight out, he's implying and inferring that same-sex marriage would be a lie. It wouldn't really be marriage at all. So by not saying this straight out, by putting these sort of statements right next to each other, what he wants to do is he wants the readers themselves to draw out that conclusion themselves, because there's nothing more powerful than the readers forming their own conclusion based on what they've read, because something that they think themselves is more likely to stay in their minds and their hearts with conviction. All right, so I hope this read through has given you some ideas of more things that you can talk about in this analysis.